So have you ever made a mistake? Or have you ever committed a sin? We want to go even a little bit deeper than that. Or how about this, another question. Have you ever committed that same sin again, and then you didn't learn from it that time, so you did it again? And then just to make sure it was like really in there, you did it again. Right? Now, that's a very real thing for a lot of us, and I think that it's a natural thing because we're affected by a lot of different, forces from outside and within, like that passage we read in chapter 7 of Romans, because you're going to feel like a cultural pull to make certain choices. Like, so if you have an unhealthy work environment, or you have an unhealthy circle of friends, or if you have unhealthy habits that are going to like make you more inclined to make those kind of sinful, harmful choices. But then you also have like just things that you've been through, right? And so when we go through those times, I think what can happen is that we begin to feel like I'm never going to do this right? And then you add into that the relationship dynamic with God. Because a lot of people I know, again, I'll talk to people and they'll say, I was doing so well for so long. Like I actually had a good quiet time with the Lord pretty consistently. I was praying regularly. I was reading scripture regularly. I was actually living this stuff out. I could see the fruit of the Spirit in my life. I could see more love and patience and kindness, because I could see all these things in my life actually blessing me and the people around me. Like I could see old hurts, old addictions, old wounds. I was starting to heal, but then all of a sudden I messed it all up and I took like 90 steps back, right? And then they get buried in that same, like that shame cycle. And it's just like, so that's what you see today happening again in Abraham. So we're in Genesis chapter 20. And again, he makes the same kind of decisions that he should know better to be making. Because if you don't remember, again, if you don't remember, you weren't here, so he has already sold his wife into essentially a sexual bondage relationship. He sold his wife into a harem of the Pharaoh. So that's the guy, right? The founder of the Jewish faith and the guy that we trace our spiritual heritage back to. This is where God met him, a guy that would trade his wife for riches. So his story's not always very clean, and it's not always one to emulate, but it is one to learn from, certainly. But today in Genesis chapter 20, we're going to see him doing the same thing. And then 6 chapters later, we're going to see his son, Isaac, do the same thing to his wife, Rebekah. So it's like these kind of sins that, are perpetuated generationally. You see in this, so we're in Genesis section 4 rather, and wrestling with reality is something that Abraham and Sarah have to do repeatedly. It's something that Lot and his daughters had to do repeatedly, and they find themselves in a position of making choices from a place of fear rather than in faith in God. These are the founders of a faith system, right, of Judaism. And then again, even Christianity traces our roots back to Abraham, as does Islam, right? And yet, this is where God meets him, a guy that would make these kind of choices when he wrestles with reality. So for the third time, especially given it's Mother's Day, I didn't try to work it out this way. We're just working through the book of Genesis. But here's God again, so so you don't miss it. For the third time, God is having to rescue a mother. So first it was Sarah when, in chapter 12, he trades her away. Then in Hagar, he has to rescue her and meet her in the desert when Abraham and Sarah at the time, Abram and Sarai were their names, when they basically ran her off because of Sarai's anger. God had to meet that poor woman and her unborn child in the desert. And then here again for the third time, God's going to do it again with Sarah in a very similar situation. Then he's going to have to do it again with Hagar for a fourth time a little bit later. So here again, as you think about Mother's Day and how, God, do you see me? There's going to be 3 major times and then a fourth to come and then more in the Old Testament of God having to rescue these mothers and these women because of the stupid choices of the guys that were supposed to care for and love them. So it's messy because this story, all of this, the whole promise begins with people that seem to want to destroy the promise that God has given these people. So that leads us to our question for part 4 is, do I trust God with the unknown? When I have to wrestle with reality and I don't know what's out there, what's going to be my reaction? What's going to be my go-to? That's a personal question for you that I'm just trying to ask you to wrestle with each week. So what happens when you face the unknown? It's a sickness. right? It's a job loss. It's your friend circle blows up. It's a rumor gets started about you. It's whatever, and you don't know what's going to be on the other side. It's finances. It's on and on and on and on and on. What is your unknown that God would say, hey, do you trust me with this? Those are hard. Those are the hard moments. It's easy to say I trust him until I have to trust him sometimes. Really easy to trust God until he actually gives me that space to trust him. So today we're going to be looking at faith over fear in Genesis 20. I've actually already titled in this series a message called Faith Over Fear, but this just keeps coming up. So I figured let's keep hitting it. So just in case you don't know where in the Bible we are, what happened last week? What happened in Genesis chapter 19? Well, we saw Sodom and Gomorrah happen, and then we saw Lot and his daughters make a terrible decision to sexually exploit their own father. So last Sunday was a pretty awkward message, but you see there something driving them, and it was fear, to make a terrible choice that would have long-lasting implications that God would redeem. So over the course of a couple thousand years, God brings this tribe, this clan, this country, the Moabites, who have a disgraceful beginning, and they end up as the family line through which Jesus' father, his earthly father, would come through. So it's cool how God will redeem anything, no matter where we've come from. But we've got that in the rearview mirror. And then this scene happens. So remember, Sodom and Gomorrah and all that stuff, Abraham just witnessed all that. But here's what he does in response. So from there, Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham traveled to the region of the Negev. So now he's on the road again, right? And he's pretty much always on the road. And he settled between two places, Kadesh and Shur. And in this area, while he was staying at Gerar, ... So that's just our where in the world are we right now. So if you see this next picture here, roughly, Sodom and Gomorrah, you can see on the bottom right there, Sodom and Gomorrah is either on the east side of the Dead Sea or on the west side, right? They've found ancient remains. You can look that up. That is Tel al-Hammam, which is a city archaeologists, wow, that was tough, have found that was literally set on fire from up above. And it wasn't a comet that slammed into the ground because there's no crater, but there was fire from above that literally flash fried this city. But it's in that general area. And then Gerar, though, is south-ish of modern-day Gaza. So just so you can kind of see where in the world that we might be, essentially what happened, though, he traveled west from Sodom and Gomorrah, and he's back over in the area where they first ran Hagar out. So ironically, he's back in the same place where he began. So what did he do while he was there, though? So immediately we see the half lie again. Abraham said about his wife Sarah, "She's my sister." So King Abimelech of Gerar had Sarah brought to him. So this is a half lie, and we find it out in this chapter that they are actually half brother and sister, which we'll talk about that weird note in a minute. But this man of faith, though, now for the second time has been presented with an opportunity to trust God after something magnificent that he just saw, and yet his first reaction is just to be fearful. Is to be fearful. So I need to tell this half-truth so that they won't kill me and take my wife. This guy Abimelech is important because he plays a huge role in this part of the story. And so Abimelech actually is probably a title like Pharaoh, because Abimelech means my father is king. And 6 chapters later, his son Isaac is going to tell the same lie about his wife Rebekah to another king, Abimelech. So again, these lies, this deceitfulness, the patterns that we set do affect other people. It seems very much the way that Abraham was lasted for several generations. So what kind of choices do we make? It matters. So this guy Abimelech, though, and we'll get to know him a little bit more, is going to essentially kidnap with Abraham's consent. It's like an agreed upon kidnapping. He's going to take this poor woman, the second time this has happened to her. And why would he do that, though? She's like in her 90s at this point, right? Sarah is not a young woman, and yet she's being taken probably for political reasons. Abraham has a lot of stuff. He's a very rich guy. He's got at least somewhat of an army because he's already gone to war and defeated another small kingdom. And so this is a guy that clearly this king wants to have relationship with. So he probably thinks that they're going to bind their little kingdoms together because Sarah herself has said that she is old and worn out. Genesis 18:12, that's how she describes herself. Like, I'm just old and worn out. How am I going to have kids, right? And so since her beauty is not mentioned, it's probably for political reasons. But again, it's like, why would he do this to his wife? So here's what I want us to see out of this little scene here. And there's like a lot of interesting lessons here. So he clearly doesn't understand what marriage is. He absolutely has no idea of the value of what God has given him. He doesn't understand the two shall become one. He doesn't understand that he should be protecting her, that this person is not just a person. She's not just a vehicle for his protection and satisfaction and happiness. And we have the same problem today. You talk to most people that are getting married, and it's like, why do you want to get married? And especially if they're younger, like, oh, they just make me so happy, right? And that can be a huge driver. But what happens when they don't make you happy anymore? Which is not going to. Spoiler alert from everybody that's a teenager or maybe not married yet, right? Like, Brittany's pretty awesome, but like, that's not her job to make myself happy, right? That's not how this works. And so if you have the wrong understanding about that, you're going to get yourself in trouble. Because we all live, right, in America, 2024, in a culture where it's just like marriage is unnecessary, marriage is a hassle, marriage is a very disposable relationship. Still, half of all marriages end in relationship or in divorce, so most people are like, don't do it. If you get married the second time, you really raise your risk of getting divorced. And if you get married a third time, you have about a 75% chance of getting divorced. Why? Because we bring the same stuff, only worse, to each relationship. And not only me, but the person that I'm getting married to. And if they've been married multiple times and we're not working our stuff out and we don't have a good understanding of what marriage is supposed to be and the hard work that it takes, and just like Abraham, we think that that person is a pawn or they're like relational collateral for me to be able to make myself happy or make myself safe, man, that creates a firestorm of issues within a relationship. Because that person probably is never going to be able to live up to your expectations of everything that they're supposed to do for you. Because here's what God said. Here's what Jesus said. Much like Kennedy said, ask not what your spouse can do for you. Ask what you can do for your spouse. Kennedy was smart. I don't know, maybe he read his Bible. He was Catholic. So, he knew the Lord. He didn't do it in his own marriage very well, but how do we avoid that? Right? How do we avoid that? This sanctity of marriage idea. Because Abraham train wrecks over and over and over again. So this is what we see. How do we avoid doing this stuff? Treating our spouse like collateral damage. We need to care for each other as you would your own body. Right? These are the mandates from God. This is what the Apostle Paul, if you want to see like Ephesians 5, Matthew 19, the end of book of Hebrews, it's like 10 or 11 or 12, somewhere in there. You have this idea of the sanctity, the beauty, the power of this relationship that he is absolutely destroying. So care for each other. Don't attack the other person, because if you do, you're attacking yourself. A lot of people don't understand they're one. Second, again, Ephesians 5, men, love women like Jesus loved and served the church. Ultimately, what did Jesus do for the church? And that means Christianity. He gave his life. He died. Tony Evans once said, guys, stop saying you'd take a bullet for your wife. He's like, 1, no, you probably wouldn't. 2, you're never going to be in a position where you're never going to have to do that, nor do you know anybody who knows anybody who's ever heard of anybody that's had to take a bullet for their wife. And I was like, yeah, I guess not. And he's like, really what you should say is, I'll die to myself. I'll get in the way of my own bullets and protect my wife that way. And I was like, man, that's good, but I don't want to do that, right? Because I'm like early in my marriage when I'm hearing this stuff. But men, that's how you need to love your wife. Because ultimately what Paul will go on to say in Ephesians 5 is that marriage is a picture of Jesus and his church, right? We are supposed to represent to the world. If you're a Christian, you're supposed to represent to the world what Jesus and his church, what Jesus and Christianity are like. That's a high level of commitment and service to one another. And then lastly, protect and defend each other and keep the marriage bed pure. That comes from out of the book of Hebrews and the Old Testament law. It's like, and he did none of these. He did none of these. He did not respect his wife. He did not protect his wife. And then he sold her up for the second time now to another man. He misunderstood all of these things. And I just said, man, like, what is going on here? Like, how are we doing with this in America? Like, do we have a good understanding? Do I have a good understanding? Do people in my church, Lord, have a good understanding of what marriage is supposed to be? And if we read these old stories and we see what these people do, don't emulate everything they do. Learn from everything that they do. Right? There's real valuable lessons here in how it compares to the rest of Scripture. And then lastly, so that's what Abraham did. That's his part. But then lastly, though, the other issue here, the big issue for God is that he kidnaps her. So here's what God does to Abimelech. So God's going to show up and he's going to deal with Abimelech first. And he says to Abimelech in a dream by night, you are about to die because the woman you have taken, for she is a married woman. So this is a pretty intense dream to have. He shows up. I don't ever want to go to sleep one night and have God show up and be like, hey, Kyle, yes, Lord, you're going to die. Right? Like that's what's happening to Abimelech right now because of what he's done. And it's hard to find this out, but there's only about 20 recorded dreams where God speaks to people in the Bible. And I thought there would be like way more. I thought it'd be like 200. I don't know. I had no idea. And he doesn't do it very often. And then he's doing it here to somebody that doesn't even believe in him, doesn't even know him. So it's cool that God is reaching into a different culture, and he's like, look, I can make myself known to whoever I want, however I want. But he only does it about 20 times, and it's always pretty significant when he does. But the charge is, you have taken this woman, right? There's the adultery, obviously, that's not happened, but there's the potential. But God is going to protect this woman. And you're going to see now from this point out, especially, again, it's interesting, it was Mother's Day today, how he goes all out to protect this woman, this future mother. So, how did he respond? What was Abimelech's story? So verse 4, now Abimelech had not approached her. Now, what does that mean? Like he hadn't gone up and said hi to her yet? Like they hadn't had coffee or tea yet? The word there, not approached her, is karab. And that Hebrew word, because the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, means he's not gone near her. And whenever you see that, pretty much in the Old Testament law, that has some kind of like sexual overtone to it. So what specifically in that culture is being said is he didn't go anywhere near her sexually. And that's important for several reasons. One, God is going to protect this woman. But two, God just promised Abraham, hey, about a year from now, Isaac's going to be born. So she can't be running around with a different dude if there's going to be this promised child that's going to come from Abraham and Sarah, right? So there's actually a lot going on behind the scenes here. But the overtones, though, is like the writer is making clear here he did not do anything. And that's really what saves his life, because he didn't just approach her in that way. He had not done anything to her. So his response, though, because the fact that he took her is enough for God. So he says, Lord, Adonai, not Yahweh, would you destroy a nation even though it's innocent? And Abraham just prayed that in Genesis chapter 19 about Sodom. And then verse 5, didn't Abraham himself say to me, she's my sister? And then she herself, and this is a sad thing about their culture, women didn't have much of a voice then, right? So she's going to go right along with this deceit, this half lie, and she repeats it to this guy, knowing what's going to happen to her. But if you understand culturally the position that Sarah is in, she is really a pawn between these two men. This is a really sad story that's happening to her, and once again, God has to intervene to protect this woman from some guy, Abraham, that should have been protecting her, that should have seen her as one with himself. And yet he didn't. So she's in on it. She says, he is my brother. I did this, Abimelech says, with a clear conscience and clean hands. And it's like, kind of, because he did kidnap her. Verse 6, then God said to him in the dream, yes, I know that you did this with a clear conscience. I have also kept you two things. I've kept you from sinning against me, like doing the sexual sin, and then I've not let you touch her. So he's intervening for this woman, but that's not it, because he's got to do something. He's not just off the hook. Here's what he's got to do. Now return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, first time used in the Old Testament. So Abraham is the first prophet in the Old Testament, and he will pray for you, and you will live. But if you don't return her, know that you will certainly die, you and all you, or those who are with you. So basically, he's like, look, Abimelech, if you don't do what I say, exactly what I say, you're a dead man walking. This is it. This is the end of your story, man. They put a period after the end of your name in this, and you're done. Like, you never show up again. And so he's pretty scared, right? He's having this dream, and he's having this sense of like, oh my gosh, this might be it. So he's got to go to this prophet. And it's the first time, Navi, that it's used in the Old Testament. And it's used of Abraham. Now, what is a prophet? Now, if you're like me, I was in college, and I was about 14 seconds out of the Marine Corps, so I was invincible and I knew everything. And so I was in this professor's class of religion. It was like a world religions kind of overview class. And this guy had been teaching this class for years, and I'm sure he loved throwing out this question to all his little eager beaver students. And he says to the students, and he's probably asked it 100 times, and he has probably murdered 100 students with that question. He said, hey, what is a prophet? And I didn't even raise my hand. I was just like, it's somebody who tells the future. And everybody in the class, because that's what we all think about prophets, everybody's like, yeah, good answer. And I'm like, I know it's a good answer. That's right. And I could just see, I was too dumb and arrogant at the time. I could see it on his face. And he was just like, hook, line, and sinker, right? I'm going to make an example out of this guy. And I didn't see it coming, right? Lamb to the slaughter. And I just started to argue with this guy. And he's just letting me go. He's giving me more line, and I don't realize that he's going to jerk it on me. And so I think I know what's going on. And by the end of the conversation, I'm going back and forth, and he just slowly is taking my knees out from under me. And finally, I have to admit that a prophet is just somebody that speaks on behalf of the Lord. That's what a prophet is. And I learned it forever. So now you know. So if somebody asks, don't say they tell the future, because sometimes they don't. Sometimes they reveal things that nobody else knows. Sometimes they do reveal the future. But take King David, when he does the whole Bathsheba thing, right? He's got Nathan and Gad there in his life. Those are the two prophets that are kind of helping him through that. And they're going to come to him, and Gad is going to say to him, Nathan's going to say to him, they're going to call him out on things, and eventually they're going to tell the story and say, hey, I know what you did. You killed that guy, and you took his wife. Right? That's not about the future. It's just like, this you did. You didn't think anybody was going to know, but I'm here to tell you, God knows, and you're going to be held accountable for what you did to this woman and her husband. This is King David of all people. Right? So that's what a prophet does. That's what you see him showing up to do, is to speak on behalf of God. So it's cool, because he said, Abraham, you're going to bless all the people on the earth. And this is him actually making this messy, sinful, lying, cowardly guy step into the role that he's called him to. He's going to make him step into it. You are to you exist to bless other people. So I'm going to force this guy to come to you, and then you're going to have to bless him. You got to get on board with this, Abraham, and stop making these dumb choices and be the man I've called you to be. It's interesting the patience God has with this guy. Thankfully, he's got the same patience with me and with you. He doesn't just smite us, right? He calls us up, calls us out, calls us to better things. So then how does he respond to this? This next section is interesting because both of these guys really have something that need to apologize for, but only one of them really does. Verse 8, early in the morning, Abimelech gets up after this terrifying dream. He calls his servants together, and he personally told them, these are cool details, and he personally told them all the things that he dreamed, and the men were terrified. This takes wisdom for a leader to be worried about your people, genuinely concerned about what's going to happen to you, your family, your people. And he calls all his officials out. And the king had to have this is a good leadership lesson. The king had to have a lot of humility to admit to his team, his servants really, that he'd done something wrong, really wrong. And it was going to cost everybody dearly if he didn't do something about it. A lot of leaders won't do that. So if you're a leader, learn something from this guy Abimelech. If you do something wrong, man, own it. Talk to your team about it. The culture that creates, man, that is so good. And so this ungodly guy, right, this man that was not a part of the faith, understands that he's done something wrong, and he gets real humble about it. But first, though, before he does that, he's going to react to Abraham in a way that I think is amazing. I love what he goes and says to Abraham. So here's what he says. And this line of conversation happens 3 times. One, it's already happened in chapter 12 of Pharaoh, here in chapter 20, and then his son, Isaac, is going to have the same thing said to him in chapter 26. So this guy comes back to him, calls Abraham out, and says, what have you done to us? How did I sin against you that you have brought such enormous guilt on me, and not just me, on my kingdom? You have done things to me that should never be done. And then Abimelech finishes with Abraham, and he says, what made you do this? So he is totally calling him out for the sin that he has committed. You have no reason to have done this to me. And yet you show up and you bring this on me, on my house, on my family, and on my kingdom. And I wonder, as I was reading through this week, I'm like, man, was this God speaking through this guy? This rebuke, was that God just speaking into Abraham's life? I want you to feel this. Because clearly, Abraham, you are not learning a lesson. We already walked through this, and here we are again. I just wonder, was God letting him have a little bit through this king? But yeah, this is where it happens. Again, the same line of questioning. With Pharaoh, it's already happened. Here in chapter 20, and then his son Isaac's going to get the same rebuke in chapter 26. So here's his justification. Here's Abraham's somewhat cowardly response. He replied, I thought, was his first mistake, there is absolutely no fear of God in this place. They'll kill me because of my wife. And there it is. It's like, boom, I incorrectly judged you, and I've justified my attitude, my sin, my choices because I put you in a box. It's like he just saw Sodom and Gomorrah happen. He just saw the protection that God would give him, and yet he's like, oh, well, look, fear drove my choices, so I did this. And so Abraham's fear wrongfully judged these people, and then he justified what he was going to do. This is one that hits home really for me. It's easy for me to judge people and then justify my attitude toward them. It's okay to make judgments about people, right? If I know you've been put in jail several times for shoplifting, I'm probably not going to ask you to hold on to my wallet. I'm going to make a good judgment there, right? But being judgmental and doing it wrongly, right? Jesus says you need to check the plank in your own eye before you what? Remove the speck in somebody else's eye. That means you're going to remove the speck in their eye. Not that you don't have any right to do that. Check your own heart first so that you can make a right judgment. Here's Abraham just being judgmental. So what people are like that for you? What people are sinners? What people don't you like or agree with? Is it political? Right? And you've just written them off? Could it be race? Or gender even? Could it be, those people that are like that? I mean, what is it for you? Your boss? Your employees? People at school? Your teachers? We all have these people that we just make judgments about them. And then I've even talked to people that then they outright justify sin. Well, this person did this and this person did this, and so now I'm going to, unrelated to them, and this is trauma response, I'm going to do this, this, and this, and this to these unrelated people because they did that to me. And now I'm going to spend the rest of my life, blah, 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 blah. We justify because of things that have happened. And that's what Abraham is doing. He's just justifying his sinful attitude and his sinful actions because he made these snap judgments. And then to make that personal, I asked myself, how much does God need to do for me before I just start trusting him automatically? Because think about all the stuff to this point, if you've been following along with us, all the stuff that God has done for Abraham, all the things that he's gotten him through, all the stuff he's bailed him out of, and yet his first response isn't to trust. It's fear. So I asked myself, when do I get to that point where my first response is just trust? Not that I won't have fear, not that I won't struggle, but it's just I need to get that window closed more, I know, in my own life to where I get to trust quicker. How much do I need to see, right? That's just what I've been asking this week. And so also, here's another thing. People look around the world, around our country, around our towns, and they just think it's getting so bad. And it's really easy to write the world off. It's really easy to write people off. But here's the danger. This next slide. This is what you see Abraham do, and this is what I think I can sometimes see Christians even doing. When we operate out of a judgmental attitude, right? When we do that, that's our starting place. And when our starting place then is coupled with fear because of our judgmental attitudes, that fear of the unknown, when we operate from there, we can cause harm and we can condemn culture to death. That sounds like a really heavy thing, but that's literally what Abraham's doing. But I can see Christians doing this. We make judgments about people. They don't want to hear the gospel anyway. And to hell with all of them because they're just doing this and they're abominable. They're this and that. And we just write huge swaths of people off that Jesus died on the cross for. That's ridiculous. That kind of stuff makes God angry when we do that. Because that's saying, I'm just fearful of these people and everything they're doing, so I'm not going to go anywhere near them. And here's what I see people do. Our circles get smaller and smaller and smaller. We stop hanging out with unbelievers because unbelievers are messy and sinful and, yuck. Right? When the call of Jesus is to always widen the circle. Jesus says it's bad out there. Jesus says there's death and there's disease and there's unfairness and all these things are out there. They all happen to him, right? And yet he says, go, because the world needs you. That's why I came, because of the issues that you don't like and the issues that you see all over your feed and on the news and all this stuff. And we can't operate out of judgmental attitudes and fear of the unknown. Because here's what Jesus said we should fear. This is kind of a heavy verse for today, but Matthew 10:28, he says, look, don't fear those who can kill the body, but are unable to touch the soul, right? They can kill your body. They can't touch your soul. He says, rather, fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. It's like, yikes, Jesus. But essentially he's saying, look, fear God, not people. Like, put that in the right place. And so don't write culture off. Don't be so fearful of culture. You don't want nothing to do with it, like Abraham clearly did. But he says, you got to lean in. I need you to be the light. Not everyone is Sodom and Gomorrah. So, back to our passage. So that was the attitude that he had. But he goes on with his justification. He says, besides, and here's his loophole, here's his moral justification. She really is my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. Now today, that's like, okay, gross, Abraham, real gross. Right? But that right there was a common practice back in the day. It's called endogamy, and even up through the kings and queens in England, right? Some of those kings, like if you read the history, like they couldn't close their mouths, their tongues were hanging out of their mouth, they're like drooling down the front of their shirt. Why? Because you can't have kids with your siblings. It's not a good thing, right? And so we look back on this. It's interesting too. It's like, why would you do this? God actually had to tell people in the Old Testament law, Leviticus chapter 18, he had to make it a law, you can't have sex with your sister. That's off limits. Also, stay away from your stepsister, because that makes things weird too. And just in case I'm not clear enough, don't marry sisters and have kids with them, because that's going to get weird also. Like, he actually had to outlaw all these things. So here's what I was thinking this week. People are like, what? I don't know if I would even know what you're thinking, Kyle. I was like, this is so weird, because like, so once they had the Old Testament law, right? So this is like 400 or 500 years later when God gives the law. When they finally got it, they're going to look back centuries at Abraham and Sarah, and it's going to dawn on some people quicker than others that the founders of their faith had an illegal and illicit marriage. And I said that to Brittany this week, like 2 days ago, because I'd never really thought about that. And I was like, and she was like, but isn't that cool though? Like, she said, isn't that cool though, that God would meet this messy inbred couple. She didn't say that, but I wanted to add it for effect. Just to clarify, that he would meet this messy couple and right where they were and do something with them. And he would work through them and bless them and all their messiness. And God would say, I'm going to just show up, guys, and we're just going to start here. Wow, this is not the best place, but we're going to start here, right where you are. And I was like, that's a great point, because I love that God actually does that with me. And I love that God does that with you. He doesn't expect you to be perfect before he's going to start using you. Now, you might have consequences for your dumb choices. Don't get me wrong. But I love that God's like, no, you don't have to clean yourself up first. Like, I'll take care of that part. We'll work on that part. But I'm calling you out. I want to use you. I love that God will meet us there instead of waiting for perfection. Like, this is something cool that you see. So, good job, Brittany. All right. And then he goes on. He says, when God made me wander from my father's house, I said to her, my wife, show me your loyalty so that whenever we go, wherever we are, I want you to say this about me. He's my brother. So he says right here, he's basically admitting fear drove his decisions right from the very beginning. Now, granted, this is before he knows God. This is before God has done all these cool things in him. And yet here we are, all these years later, like decades later, and he's still making the same fear-driven choices. Nothing's changed. Nothing's changed for him. So he's my brother. And here's what I see out of Abraham. When faith and fear collide, the question for myself, in this unknown space, this fear-driven space, what's going to happen for you? You personally. Like, what do you do when your faith and your fears collide in your life because there's the unknown? Right? It's good to think about. Then Abimelech took the flocks, herds, male and female slaves, and he gave them to Abraham. Now, God didn't say to do any of that stuff. He said, just give the woman back. But there's like a little political undercurrent going on here. Like, he wants to make okay, this guy's protected. This guy's blessed by somebody that can invade my dreams. So I'm going to do a little bit extra. I'm going to give him some stuff. right? And then he returns his wife Sarah to him. And Abimelech said, look, my land is before you. Settle wherever you want, right? Just trying to sweeten the pie a little bit here. And then he says to Sarah, and this scene right here is really unique in the ancient world. Women didn't have any rights. Women very often were pawns of the men in their lives, unfortunately. So what God has to do in the Old Testament repeatedly is he has to step in and give protection, sometimes through the law, sometimes through scenes like this, because they didn't get it. So the Bible is very radical in the culture it's written in, Old and New Testament, because of the protections offered, and especially how Jesus really elevated women and empowered women, and they were important parts of his ministry, and you see that in the New Testament church. But in that world back then, like, this scene right here is not something that happened. So this shows you the level of fear that this guy had of God. He says, look, I'm giving your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. So again, way above and beyond here. But this part right here is completely debasing for a king to do for a woman. He said, it's a verification of your honor to all who are with you. You are fully vindicated. He's not saying this to Abraham. He's giving a public apology to a woman. Like, this is an insane cultural thing that he would actually do this. But again, it shows the level of protection and honor that God demands for this woman, Sarah. It's like, again, it's kind of cultural undercurrent stuff that it's hard to just, it's easy to read through and hard to pick up sometimes, but it's really cool to see what's happening right here and how God is elevating this woman in spite of the men in her life. It's a really cool story, especially on Mother's Day. It's kind of cool. All right, so verse 17, then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech. He healed his wife. He healed his female servants, right? His slaves, his harem, so he's not like the best guy, so that they could bear children. For the Lord had completely closed all the wombs in Abimelech's household. Why? On account of Sarah, Abraham's wife. This whole scene unfolded because he was going to protect this woman. He was going to protect the promise that he gave to them, right? It's like no matter what, in spite of Abraham continuing trying to wreck the promise, God just keeps stepping in on account of his wife, Sarah. So, neat little prayer note too. Then Abraham prayed to God, and then God healed Abimelech. It's like God didn't move until Abraham prayed. That's cool. Like, what's God waiting on you to pray for? I've heard several people say that throughout my life. What's God waiting on you to pray about? He's just going to move when you do. It's like, so you see it happen in Scripture sometimes. But he builds walls, God does, to protect this woman, right? One, he doesn't let this guy touch her. And then two, nobody in his household, which she was now a part of, was able to get pregnant. So 2 walls of protection around this woman, just so it would be clear, where did this child come from? Well, it didn't come from Abimelech. I built walls of protection around this woman, and I pulled her literally out of this scenario. So, when we look at faith over fear here in Genesis chapter 20, there was 3 things that stuck. Well, there's a bunch, but there was 3 things especially I just wanted to close with. The first one is the big obvious one. Don't let your fear be bigger than your trust in God. That is such a hard thing to do. I could make a bumper sticker out of this, and I could have Trish print them up for us. And I could leave them at the top of the stairs, and we'd be like, yeah, I'm going to put it on my Nalgene, baby, and everybody can see it at work. And then all of a sudden, your job is in jeopardy at work, and you're just like, oh my gosh, and you're trying to scrape it off. Right? Because fear does funny things to us. So we got to make that choice. We got to look at the things in our lives. Like I said, I've probably said it before. When you face the difficulties ahead, make sure you keep one eye in the rearview mirror so you can see what God has done in your past. Right? Don't just focus on the problems ahead of you. Always make sure to look at what God has done in your past. That's going to help you get through those times. And Abraham clearly forgot. Probably because they didn't have rearview mirrors, right? Number 2, don't be too quick to dismiss sinners. Jesus said, you go out there and you go be with them. You pray with and for them. You share the gospel. You invite them to church. You invite them to small group. You send Bible plans to them when they're struggling with X, Y, or Z. You be that light. Yes, the world is a tough place. That's why you're in it. Right? That's why your soul's been redeemed, so you can go and be a difference maker. An eternal difference maker, right? So we can't run from the world and tighten our circles up. Man, we got to be out in it, and it's tough. So don't be too quick to dismiss those sinners. They may not be as bad as you think. And then lastly, especially for our moms, in the good and bad, God's with you. Right? Bad things are going to happen. This woman, Sarah, lots of bad stuff actually did happen to her. Hagar, another woman he had to protect, bad stuff happened to her. Right? But God sees you. When she's out in the desert, Hagar, I know you see me, I know you hear me. The message that's given to her. Sarah, right there with her. in spite of the choices made by the people that are supposed to love and protect her. In the good and bad, God's with us. And thankfully, the good news, in spite of the hard lives, in spite of the difficulties, here's where we'll end today. Thank God, the answer is in Jesus Christ, our Lord. That's the truth that we have. That's where we put our hope, not in what's ahead of us, but who's got us, right? Who we belong to. That's the strength of when you follow Jesus Christ. When you give your life to him and you say, Lord, I can't do this now. I can't do this forever. I need a Savior. Like, that's what it means to belong to the Creator, is that you can put your hope in that kind of stuff right there. So let me pray on that. Lord, I thank you so much for today. I thank you for these stories of very real and imperfect people, Lord. I thank you for meeting them where they were and just molding them and the hope that gives me. And I pray, Lord, for all of us here, watching, listening, whatever. Lord, I pray that you're going to speak to us, whatever our fear stuff is. Would you help us with that trust part, that faith part? Just like the guy that was worried about losing his son, he says, Lord, I do believe. Help me with my unbelief. I just pray, Jesus, you'd help us with our unbelief whenever we come up against it. And I pray that in your name, Jesus Christ. Amen. All right, that's all we got. I love you. Happy Mother's Day.